Buenas noches, konbanwa. So I have the distinct pleasure and also the pressure of, in some ways, setting up the context in the history for what we're going to keep building upon tonight. Thank you. Because so much of what we're talking about right now, in terms of accessibility in immersive experiences, in the performing arts, really in life on the planet in general, has its groundings in generations of work done by folks, advocates, activists who have come before us. So in my first few impulses of in terms of what to talk about, I wanted to cover all 250 years of disability movements in the US. And I realized I can't do that in 10 minutes. At least not have that be in any way legible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share just some details that hopefully will inspire you to continue your own learning into the incredibly rich, emotional, victorious, painful, multifaceted history of the fight for dignity, for independent living, and for equal access for people living with disabilities in this country. So think of this more as a series of provocations. So if we think about movements for equal opportunities and equal rights for people with disabilities in the US, folks, this movement dates back to the founding of the country that we now call the United States, because one of the very first acts of the Constitutional Congress in 1776 was to create a pension fund to support soldiers who had been wounded and disabled during the Revolutionary War. It is embedded in the fabric of this country. And then throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, we saw other incredible organizations that became the models for dozens, hundreds of other advocacy groups that exist today, such as in 1817, the founding of the American School for the Deaf, founded in Connecticut. In 1864, Congress authorizing the first college for the deaf and hard of hearing, which we now know as Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. The National Association of the Deaf, founded in Cincinnati in 1880. And then, as we accelerated into the 20th century, the pace of the work only accelerated. So for example, in 1908 and 1909, we started to see organizations that were focused on providing improved, expanded, and accessible mental health services. So the organizations that we now know as Mental Health America and Mental Health Connecticut. In 1935, Congress passing the Social Security Act. In 1946, the federal government establishing the National Institute of Mental Health. In 1956, the Social Security Disability Program being created. 1961, the American National Standard Institute publishing the first standards for architectural access codes. In 1962, Edward Roberts suing to gain admission to the University of California in Berkeley, making him that university's first student with severe disabilities. I mean, this is just a touch upon the surface. And the 1960s is often recognized as let's see, let's get it to go. All right. Oh, there it goes. So the 1960s is officially, I believe, recognized to be the beginning of what we now recognize as a disability rights movement. But it was founded on the work not only done by disability advocates, but also inspired by the civil rights movement and the women's rights movements that were unfolding right alongside. So just looking at the period from 1965 to roughly the 90s and into today, and in a moment Carol's going to give us even more context about one of these laws, we saw several different things unfolding. So for example, Medicare and Medicaid being established in 1965 and what that allowed in terms of resources for accessible health care. 1965, the Voting Rights Act also guaranteed the right for people with disabilities to go to a polling place with someone to assist them, someone who wasn't their boss or any kind of a political operative, but for the first time, their access to to accessibility for polling places was guaranteed. In 1968, the Architectural Barriers Act required federal buildings to be accessible. 1973, the handicap parking stickers were unveiled in Washington, D.C. I love this detail. Carol, thank you so much for reminding me about this. In 1978, 19 Denver protesters in wheelchairs captured national attention by blocking 2 buses at Colfax and Broadway, chanting, "We will ride." Their protest eventually helped them achieve their goal of gaining wheelchair accessibilities for all buses in Denver, in turn sparking a national movement for accessibility in public transportation. In 1988, Congress named October as National Disability Employment Awareness Month to be able to counter the invisibility of job discrimination. And in 1990, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. So much to talk about with any of these events, and also to talk about what is not listed up on the screen, which also deserves her attention. But what I was struck by, and even looking at the information that is widely available online and in other resources, were some overriding themes about these various movements for dignity and access, and the questions that they were raising. Because we here at the Denver Center for the Performing Arts are also grappling with these questions. And among them is, first of all, how do we define disability? Because each subsequent generation has attempted to provide language to describe an experience. So that question of how do we define disability brought me to 2 of the major models for us to talk about disability. One of which I suspect is going to be very familiar to most of us, which is the medical model. It's the way of defining disability that focuses or links a disability diagnosis to an individual's physical body, focusing on curing or managing illness or disability, often by use of technology, often by ways of trying to mitigate the impacts of individual limitations. And in fact, these are the definitions that we have inherited via our dictionaries, for example. So Merriam-Webster talks about a physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition that impairs, interferes with, or limits a person's ability to engage in certain tasks or actions, or participate in typical daily activities and interactions. The Cambridge Dictionary one I was particularly struck by: a physical or mental condition that makes someone unable to act in a way that is considered usual for most people. There is so much to unpack in this language. But basically, the medical model focuses on adapting an individual's functionality to conform to existing social norms and structures, right? So on the one hand, while it is incredibly exciting that technology is affording us more and more access to devices that do empower us to navigate the world as freely as possible, there's also a lot here that we have an opportunity to unpack if we simply invert the model of thinking about disability and about what we do in our everyday practice. And for many folks, this is known as the social model of thinking about disability. And under the social model, we're focusing on describing a socially constructed experience that identifies systemic barriers, negative attitudes, and exclusion by society, purposely or unintentionally, as contributory factors in disabling people. So recognizing that while physical, sensory, intellectual, or psychological variations may cause individual functional limitations or impairments, these lead to disability only if society fails to take into account of and include people regardless of their individual differences. So the social model distinguishes between impairment, thinking about individual attributes, and disability, which it ascribes to social limitations, right? So for example, if I need a wheelchair to be able to navigate the world, and I come across a place that is only accessible by stairs, the wheelchair is a part of my physical experience in the world. However, I am disabled by the lack of a ramp, or only being confronted with stairs. You see, right? So thinking about disability in that way, I think really invites us to think more systemically about what are the barriers that we are inadvertently putting in the path of the folks that we want to go beyond welcoming into our spaces, including them in our spaces, creating spaces that are reflective and affirming of folks who may not currently find themselves at home with us. And barriers can show up in a lot of different ways, and they tend to show up in large buckets. So one of the first ones that I want to talk about were attitudes that we may not even be aware we're espousing. So thinking about negative attitudes for people with disabilities can show up explicitly as bullying, discrimination, and fear. We know this to be true, but it also shows up implicitly expressed in our language and in our prevailing narratives, right? So if you think about what are the stories that we're telling, do we tend to tell stories about overcoming disability, about finding inspiration from struggle, right? Some folks call that inspiration porn, right? Richard III, Richard III, Richard III, who are the villains in our stories, right? But even if we just think about the English language, notions of the body are embedded in our everyday metaphors. So if you've ever found yourself talking about a point of view, or your mind's eye, or giving someone a hand, keeping your ear to the ground, getting to the heart of the matter, facing a problem, shouldering one's responsibility, talking about the mouth of a cave or the foot of a mountain, the leg of a table or the arm of a chair. The body is in every conscious facet of our being. We can't escape it. However, what we can be mindful of is being aware that the stigmas historically associated with disability are also very much embedded in our language. So if you find yourself ever using these phrases, I invite you to think about it. Turning a deaf ear, being blind to the facts, having a crazy schedule, that's so dumb. Being confined to a wheelchair, calling someone an idiot, telling someone to not be a spaz, talking about how your workload is insane, being crippled by debt, describing some place as a madhouse, or saying that movie was lame. Folks, there are so many aspects of ableism that are embedded in our language that we may not even be aware are actually keeping someone from finding a place with us. And so what can we do to counteract that? It begins with awareness. If a culture's language is full of pejorative metaphors about a group of people, that culture is not going to see those people as fully entitled to the same inclusion as people in a more favored group. Language matters. As do other barriers to access, one of which I suspect we're going to be talking about a great deal here tonight, which is our physical environments. Inaccessible physical environments, either natural or built, foster a lack of inclusion. And that is why many advocates, for example, in talking about physical environments, are talking about things like universal design, which was coined by our architect Ron Mace in the 1960s, as an approach to design that conceives of buildings, of products, of experiences, as from its conception, trying to design for the broadest possible access and use by the largest spectrum of people, regardless of disability or limitations. When you design physical environments that are accessible by the widest number of people, especially people with disabilities, you are inherently creating spaces that have increased accessibility, that provide for ease of movement, and that are inherently safer for everyone who encounters that movement. And if you want one such example, how many of you have been to the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley? Reagan, you've been there. Anyone else? Oh, another hand. If you ever find yourselves in the Bay Area and you find you have a little time to go to Berkeley, California, stop by the Ed Roberts campus. It's right across the street from one of the BART stations. And if you recognize the name Ed Roberts, that student who sued for access to UC Berkeley, he went on to found the independent living movement. This is a building that is built from the ground up using universal design concepts. So for example, every single floor in this building, which houses 7 agencies devoted to serving people with disabilities, it's all accessible by one central ramp in this beautiful lobby. There are no stairs in this building. All of the elevators are accessible by kick buttons or like the typical buttons that we find in elevators. The pavement that leads you to the front door is textured. So for folks using canes or other devices to help with low visibility, the very pattern of the concrete helps to guide you in and guide you around the building. It's really stunning. I invite you to visit, and they love talking about their facility and the work they do. And finally, thinking about institutional practices where, we have the power to change so much about our everyday practices as organizations, institutions, as artists. And these practices, they don't always have to look like laws. Certainly laws, policies, practices, and strategies can implicitly or explicitly disadvantage people with disabilities, and unfortunately, the history of this country provides too many examples of how they have done precisely that. So, just to give you an idea of what has been done in the name of society in the past. Let's see. How many of you have heard of ugly laws? These were laws that existed pretty much up until the 1970s. That prohibited not only unsightly beggars from being on the streets, but also prohibited people with disabilities or anyone who presented as having a disability or a disease from appearing in public. People could be arrested. People were deemed illegal for presenting other than being able-bodied. The last of these laws were not repealed until 1974. Denver had such a law, enacted in 1889. The Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924 allowed for compulsory sterilization of individuals deemed to be feeble-minded. And in the 20th century, from 1946 until 1953, Quaker Oats, MIT, and Harvard conducted a long-running experiment wondering how minerals metabolize in the human body using children with developmental disabilities who were invited to join a science club. The lawsuits pending from the damage done to those children weren't settled until the 1990s. So we don't have to think about openly discriminatory practices in these large systemic ways. Unfortunately, we're still battling many of these realities, but we can think about what we have the power to change today, especially in the ways in which current federal law not only invites us to be part of the solution, but also where there are still opportunities for us to do even better, right? So with that, I'm going to bring Carol up here to talk about what is the current state of the law.